Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Derek Mosley. I'm the director of Marquette Law School's Lubar Center. I want to welcome you to our first poll program of the new 2025. And as always, I'm joined by Dr. Charles Franklin. Charles, it's good to see you.
Thanks for coming.
I'm going to go over our topics of the day before we get started. But before we get started, a lot's kind of happened with you and the poll since we last met. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that congratulations are in order for Nate Silver ranking the Marquette Law Poll the second best poll out of 500 in regards to reliability and transparency. So congratulations to Dr. Franklin.
And thank you, Nate, for that.
Yeah, right. But let's get started. We're going to go over some topics that we're going to dwell on during the course of this program. We're going to start off, as always, with the methodology of the poll. Have Dr. Franklin talk to us about that. The candidates on the April 1st ballot, we have a Supreme Court race, as well as a Department of Public Instruction race as well. Few views of the Trump presidency so far. Going to talk about education issues, some Supreme Court issues, budget and policy issues, and then hopefully have enough time to get into the approval of the governor, legislature, and Supreme Court. So, Charles, if we could start with the methodology.
Yep. So this is pretty standard. We were in the field February 19th through the 26th. We interviewed 864 registered voters. That has a margin of error of 4.6 percentage points. We asked a number of policy questions of a random half of the sample. By doing it that way, we get to ask twice as many policy questions as if we asked everybody. That does cost us a little bit. It means the margin of error is 6.6 points on the half sample issues. I don't think it practically matters for the questions that we're asking. If they're close, they're close. If they're not close, they're not close. I think it'll be fairly obvious. But for those keeping track at home, all of those half sample issues are listed in the release at the end of the release. So you can keep track of what's full sample and what's half sample. There. The partisan makeup of the sample is 36 Republican, 32 Democrat, 32 Independent. When you put independents who say they are closer to one party or the other in as partisans, then it's 46 Republican, 42 Dem, and 13 Independent. A lot of folks are independent but then lean one way or the other. For comparison, in all of the polls we did in 2024, that was over about 7 statewide polls, the combined samples were 33 Republican, 31 Dem, 36 Independent, but when you looked at the independents as partisans, it's 45 Republican, 42 Dem, 12 Independent. So this sample is 4 points more Republican than Democrat. The average over last year by the same measure was 3 points more Republican than Democrat. This is something that's been changing, and we touched on it way back in October, if anybody can remember that far back. But here's the trend over the entire history of the poll. And you can see that when we began in 2012, we had a few more Democrats than Republicans. It was about a 31 to 27, about a 4-point Democratic lean. Then you see this long period from about 2019 till a couple of years ago when the two were about even, but Republicans had a 1 or maybe a 2-point advantage. But then in 2024, you can see the line split a little bit, with Republicans having a bit of an edge throughout 2024, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. I just told you what the totals look like. And so this 4-point Republican margin that we see today has been pretty consistent over the last little more than a year. We're, of course, watching this to see how it changes, but I want to bring you up to date about where our latest estimates of where partisanship stands in the state.
So we're going to move on to the spring elections. And what's interesting about the spring elections is someone who ran in the spring elections, nobody knows who runs in spring elections. And so could you tell us a little bit about the two races, statewide races?
Funny thing about that. So these are the candidates for the April 1st ballot. Former Attorney General Brad Schimel is the best known, but still 38% say they haven't heard enough about him to have either a favorable or an unfavorable opinion. That jumps up to more than half, 58% for Susan Crawford. And when we go to the Superintendent of Public Instruction race, 64% lack an opinion of Underly, 71% lack opinion of Brittany Kinzer. It's because I anticipated such large unawareness of candidates, not because of these candidates, but because, as you experience, spring elections are like this, that I wanted to focus on what people know about the candidates and especially don't know about the candidates. So I'm not going to give you a horse race number today. I want to appreciate that we're a month away from the election, and more than half of the registered voters don't have an opinion of 3 out of the 4 candidates. There's going to be a lot of advertising between now and Election Day. People will come to opinions, and some of them will show up and vote. But it's a long time away, and I think trying to handicap the race this far out with this much unawareness isn't a great idea. And so that's why I'm going to show you these favorability numbers, but not the horse race numbers. We didn't ask the horse race, to be clear.
So nobody knows who they are, but how do they feel about that?
Well, that's sort of the irony, right? We have some feelings. The feelings are mostly a little negative, but they're not nearly as negative as we saw last fall, where people were negative towards most of the candidates. For Schimel, the green dot is favorable at 29. The purple dot is 32 unfavorable, so a -3 net on that, with the 38 don't know or haven't heard enough. With Crawford, it's 19 to 23, so a -4 net. With Underly, 16 to 20, -4 net. But Kinzer is the one that stands out as the net positive, 13 to 16 favorable, 16 favorable, 13 unfavorable, the only one with a net positive. But she's also the least known at 71% that don't know who she is. So I think you might take away from that that the small percentage of people that do have an opinion of her have a favorable opinion, but that's still a small group compared to the somewhat larger groups with opinions on the other candidates. But there's certainly room for movement for all of these. And as I say, we got used to the fall to seeing net favorabilities in the single digits negative and sometimes the double digits negative. These are all in the single digits negative, and in Kinzer's case, single digits positive.
What about my favorite group, the enthused and likely to vote?
Those happy people. So we know that not everybody's going to vote in the spring election, right? In 2023, when we set a record for turnout, that turnout was about 50% of registered voters, about 40% of the citizens of voting age population. So looking at everybody just shows you the big population, not the folks that are most likely to show up. So we've divided the sample. This isn't quite a likely voter screen, but it's something like that. We're looking at people who tell us first that they're absolutely certain to vote. That group of people overestimates what actual turnout is likely to be. But we also ask them how enthusiastic they are. And so we put these two groups together. So the people who are both very enthusiastic and certain to vote, that makes up about 41% of our sample. The turnout, as I told you, of registered voters was about 50%. So this may be a group that's a little more involved than the final turnout will be. But it's a better estimate of the likely electorate than everybody. What do you see here? Well, first of all, look at the red dots. The red dots are haven't heard enough. That drops to just 15% for Schimel. But it's still 30 and down to 36 for Crawford, 46 for Underly, and still over half, 53 for Kinzer. So this group does know more. I'm not showing you the comparison. If we looked at the folks that aren't enthused and aren't certain to vote, then the don't knows goes up to the 60s or more. So this really is a better informed group, but it's still far from universal knowledge of the candidates. We also see a little bit of tightening on the favorabilities here. So Schimmel is a net -1 on favorability, Crawford net -1, Underly -2, and Kinzer, though, a very solid +11. So that same phenomena we saw before. But even with this well-informed group, still 53% don't have an opinion of her. So how does this play out is an interesting question and certainly could shift this. I guess if you wanted to single takeaway, though, these candidates, aside from the differences in awareness, are pretty similar in their favorability, with Kinzer as the exception. And in the Supreme Court race, they're both dead even at -1 each, but some difference, considerable difference between the 15% that don't know Schimmel and the 36% that don't know Crawford.
Well, let's break down the Supreme Court candidates. Let's start with Brad Schimmel.
So looking at it by party identification, I'm going to warn you, you're going to see a whole lot of slides that look just like this one. So let me give you a little guide to it. If you look at the first row up there, among all registered voters, that's the top line of this. And so as you just saw a moment ago, Schimmel with everybody, these are all registered voters, 29 favorable, 32 unfavorable, 38 haven't heard enough. With Republicans, it's 56% favorable, quite favorable, only 6% unfavorable. With independents, he's a little negative, 23 favorable to 39 unfavorable. And with Democrats, there's quite a gap, 3 favorable, 60 unfavorable. But do notice the red dots. There's almost no variation in awareness of the candidates across the parties. And so this is not a case of I know my party's nominee but don't know yours. This is I equally don't know them or don't know them very well. When we go to Crawford, look at the red dots off to the right. It's a similar pattern. Mostly don't know. Democrats are a little more aware of her, a little lower don't know or haven't heard enough than Republicans or independents, but not a lot lower. And again, there is a partisan alignment, though. Republicans are pretty negative to her, 2 to 38. Independents, pretty negative, but a lot of don't knows, 12 to 23. And then among Democrats, it's only 40% favorable to 6 unfavorable, but that big 54% that don't know enough about her. Let's just do Underly. Again, you see the even higher don't know rates. You see a modest partisan divide, though it is a clear partisan divide, but it's a modest difference between Dems and Reps, primarily because of that over 60% with no opinion. And finally, with Kinzer, again, pretty uniform don't knows, a little lower among Republicans than the others, but only a little bit. And again, the party divide that is there is modest because of all the don't knows, but there is clear separation between the parties. So in these two nonpartisan races, partisans have a pretty good idea. Well, I shouldn't say that. Partisans don't really know what they think for the most part, but when they do think they know something, they line up their partisanship with the candidates reasonably well.
So we already know the unawares, right? So this next graph that you have here pretty much puts it into perspective. Not many people have heard or read or a lot about what's going on with these candidates.
Right. Well, not many. So 39% say they've heard or read a lot about the Supreme Court race. 42% say some, and 19% admit they've heard nothing at all. On the superintendent's race, though, it's half that, only 18% that have heard a lot, 47% a little, and 35% nothing at all. Let me remind you that this survey went in the field the day after the primary for the DPI race. So it's not as if we hadn't had an election that determined who the nominees or who the runoff candidates were going to be. But the schools race just isn't getting as much attention as the Supreme Court race, even though the Supreme Court race itself is still fairly low on attention.
So how clear are they on
Yeah.
where the candidates stand? Let's start with the Supreme Court.
Yeah. So this is a question of, do you have a clear idea of what the candidate stands for? You're not clear what they stands for, or again, haven't heard enough or don't know. With Schimmel, 51% say they have a clear idea of what he stands for. Only 14% say that he's not clear, or they're not clear about him, but a sizable 35% say they haven't heard enough. So it's not as if you heard a lot and you think he's very unclear. It's just that you haven't heard enough to have an opinion. The same thing, but more so with Crawford, where 41% think they're clear about what she stands for, and 17% say not clear, but 42% say they haven't heard enough about her. So again, some of this will be cured over the 4 weeks of campaigning that we have left. But again, at this point, many voters simply don't know enough to choose.
Let's spend a little time on President Trump and approval rating.
Trump, did he do anything? Did he have a speech last night or something?
Apparently he had a speech last night. This is, of course, these ratings don't take in consideration the speech.
No, they don't.
But after what you said about the election for
Yeah.
the superintendent, people
Well,
really care.
People do have opinions about Donald Trump. This is a very different world. 48% approve, 51% disapprove of the job he's doing as president. So remember when we were in the field, we were in the 3rd and 4th weeks after he took office. So he'd been in for a while. That 48-51 is very close to the split we got in our national poll that we released a couple of weeks ago. And we'll give it a little more context in a minute. But here, look at the partisan divide. 92% of Republicans approve of the job he's doing. Go to the bottom in Democrats, it's just 2% of Democrats who approve. So this is the gigantic, nearly perfectly polarized pattern that we see on a lot of questions we ask about Trump or about policies that are most closely connected to Trump. I will be at pains to point out a few cases coming up where we don't see that polarization. But the closer it comes to directly feelings about Trump, the more this polarization is extreme and on both parties' sides coming awfully close to unanimous within the party in opposite directions. Independents, though, are a bit negative. 39 approve, 60% disapprove. And so whether this 48-51 split improves for Trump or gets worse for him, well, Democrats can't make it much worse, right? They're already as negative about him as they could be. But independents can shift. Republicans can't gain very much either. So again, we're looking at that 13% of the state that are independents as being the one thing that could shift this, unless things happen that could bring Democrats to approve a little bit more of Trump, or possibly bring Republicans to disapprove of him a little bit more. Only time will tell about this, but we start with everybody's on their respective sidelines and are very clear about support or opposition.
Let's take us back to 2017 and Trump's approval rate.
Yeah, 2017 was his net approval was slightly worse, 41-47. This is March of 2017. But the parties were a little less polarized. It was only 77% approval among Republicans, and it was 81% disapproval among Democrats, not 90-something and 90-something. And independents back in 2017 were in a little bit of a honeymoon with Trump, giving him a net plus 10 on job approval. So you can see that his overall approval was a shade worse than it is now. In that sense, he is doing a little better now than he did at the same time in the first term. But the way the coalitions are split, the way the parties are aligned, and especially the way independents are, is a little different this time in starkly more partisan polarization terms.
And you have the trend, right?
Yes.
Take a look.
So, funny looking chart. On the left is every poll during his first term. You can see he was underwater on approval almost always. There's that little period, I can't make my pointer work, but the little period at the beginning of COVID, actually, when people did rally a little bit and he got very close to even job approval. But then a little later in 2020, that spread out again during the campaign. And you can see his disapproval went up quite a bit, tightening a little bit just before the election. And then the blank period, when he's not president anymore, you can see that where we stand today is just a little closer in the approve and disapprove than it was at the end of 2020 in our last poll while he was still president.
There's been a lot of talk in the news about federal agencies being closed. What's the general feel?
Here the question is, does the president have the authority to freeze and end programs or agencies without congressional approval? Does he have that authority, or is that beyond the president's authority to do? Certainly central to some of the arguments. 40% say he does have that authority, but 59% say he does not have the authority to freeze programs and close agencies. Here, Republicans are pretty solidly behind him, 74%, but 25% of Republicans don't think he has that authority. Compare that with the approval number, where it was 92% approve versus 74% support that presidential authority. Independents are quite negative about it, 35 to 65, and Democrats, again, like we saw with approval, as united against these moves as they were on approval. But it's Republicans who are a little bit less solidly behind the president. I don't want to overstate that. In virtually every chart you're going to see, a majority, and usually a solid majority, of Republicans support President Trump. But sometimes it's in the 90s, sometimes it's in the 70s, and in rare cases it falls below the 70s. So there are some variations in party unity on that.
How do people feel about DOGE?
Not quite as divided. Here the question is, do you think DOGE is properly carrying out Trump's agenda, or are they disrupting programs that are required by law? And so it's 47 think they're carrying out his agenda, 53% say disrupting programs. But here, Republicans are more united in DOGE's actions, with 88% on the president's side there. With independents, it's only 41 to 56, so a little bit negative there. And again, the nearly unanimous Democrats at 97. This is what I was telling you about. When we're looking at things that are closely associated with Trump's agenda or Trump the person, we're seeing these huge partisan divides. Whereas when we move to some questions that aren't quite as central to him, we see a little bit more disagreement. Though I think the 75% on that previous slide of Republicans having some concerns about closing programs is notable.
How do those polled feel about tariffs?
Well, Monday and yesterday we got news on tariffs, of course. And the public is quite skeptical of this. This is also in line with what we saw in our January national poll. Only 32% think tariffs will help the economy. 51% think they'll hurt the economy. And 16% say that it won't have much of an effect. And here with Republicans, a majority, 61%, think tariffs will help the economy. But again, that's 61, not 75, not 92. The independents are quite skeptical. 24 help the economy, 50 hurt. And Democrats, 92% hurt, 3% help. So the tariff issue is going to be well worth following to see how this plays out, both in its perceptible economic impact and in President Trump sticking to the tariffs. Last night, he twice said, well, there may be a bit of an adjustment required, but I haven't checked in the last 25 minutes, but he seems to still be sticking by the tariffs as of this morning's news. But the public is really skeptical of them, and that, again, is true here in the state as well as in our national polling.
Now, during the election, immigration was a key issue. How does it poll?
Yeah. Deporting immigrants in the U.S. illegally, just that. 61% favor those deportations, 38% oppose. That's close to where it was in October when we asked about it. Very heavy support with Republicans at 91. 60% of independents support these kind of deportations. And I think tellingly, a third of Democrats, 32% of Democrats support it. So this is a case where the Republicans are completely united in favor of Trump's position. Democrats, on balance, oppose it, but with a significant share of the Democrats who support deportations.
And you have another immigration question, but you framed it differently.
Yep. This next question has exactly the same start. Do you favor or oppose deporting immigrants in the U.S. illegally? But then it adds at the end, including those who've been in the U.S. for a number of years, have jobs, and no criminal record. On this one, support drops to 50% and opposition, support rises, said that wrong. Support falls from 60 to 50 and opposition rises to 50. So it's an even split, less than without the addendum of jobs and no criminal record. However, that was at 38% support in October. So even with this added consideration of jobs and no criminal record, it looks like support for deportations may have increased a little bit for those folks without criminal records. There's still the big divide between the parties, but here, many fewer Democrats support deportations in this circumstance, down to 13% instead of over a third. And Republicans are still quite united, though. It's 82% support deporting even those long-term non-criminal folks.
I don't know. Someone named Elon Musk. I think you did
doesn't
some
ring a
polling
bell
on him. Never heard of him.
No. So this is favorability to Musk: 41 favorable, 53 unfavorable, and 6% who say they don't know enough about him. They must be on Blue Sky, I guess. I'm sorry to say we don't have a Twitter user question to do a crosstab against with this one. But put that in perspective, Trump's approval was 48-51, so Musk is, on favorability, seen a little more negatively than Trump, but the two are fairly closely tied together on favorability and on job performance. Republicans very enthusiastic about Musk at 81% favorable, but not so with independents, 29 fav, 58 unfavorable, and Democrats really don't like him. Again, that pattern that we've seen so much of. Republicans at 81 is notable that it's not 91. So there is a little bit of reservation among Republicans compared to how much they approve of Trump. But you want to highlight that as long as the Republican base is staying with Trump and his actions, that shields him from any kind of internal party pressure, and 81% is still pretty solid support for Musk.
Generally, how do Republicans feel about their party?
Yeah. We're going to do a comparison here. So the top line is 47% say they have a favorable view of the Republican Party. Did I not change it?
Nope. There you go.
I turned the page here. Why didn't that move? 47% favorable, 52% unfavorable. We have not asked this question in the Wisconsin polls before, but that's a fairly solid pair of numbers when you consider how negative people are about a lot of political people and institutions. And look at the partisan split. It's just what you would think it would be. 92% of Republicans are favorable, 97% of Democrats unfavorable to the Republicans. though independents are pretty negative, 33-62. But now look at Democrats. Look at the top there, 47-52. For Democrats, it's 34-62. Much less favorability for the Democratic Party than for the Republican Party. Now, what goes on here? Well, Republicans despise the Democrats just as much as Democrats despise the Republicans, 97%. But look at Democrats. Only 76% of Democrats are favorable to their own party, compared to 92% of Republicans that were favorable to their party. And if that wasn't bad enough, look at the independents and how incredibly negative they are to the Democratic Party right now, just 15-79 unfavorable. So this is, in one sense, not news if you've been reading national polling that has shown a lot of disgruntlement with the Democratic Party. But here, I think you vividly see how it stands in the state with all kinds of implications for that shifting party balance, for the upcoming elections and the gubernatorial elections next year. On the other hand, it may not be permanent. One reason Democrats have such a negative favorability rating is they just went through over 3 years with a very unpopular president. That hurts any party. They're blamed for the losses in the fall, and they're blamed for not responding to Trump, at least within the Democratic coalition, blamed for not doing that. So I don't think this is really surprising, but it is striking what the difference here is and what the relative advantage of the two parties are at the moment. I think the advantages are favoring the Republicans right now.
All right, I think we're going to go to the Supreme Court again. This has
Yep.
to do with the election and whether it's
Yep.
going to tip the balance.
Yeah, so I emphasized on the court election how many people don't know anything about the candidates, but that doesn't mean they don't know anything. This is a question of, can this election tip the ideological balance on the court, or will the election not affect that balance? And what you see is over 80%, 83% say it can tip the balance. So I think that's a pretty fundamental thing to know about the election and what's at stake with it. And so they may not be very familiar with the candidates, but a huge majority are aware of what the issue is, what the stakes are in the race. And again, it doesn't vary much across the parties. All the parties are pretty aware of that, slightly less among independents. Is the outcome of the election, the Supreme Court election, important to you? So the dark green on the right is the percent saying very important to them. And you see that that's not nearly as high, but it's 57% overall, 55 with Republicans, 65 with Democrats, a bit lower at 43 with independents. Democrats may have a slight advantage there. 55 versus 65 is not a huge gap, but it's a bit of a gap. People know that there are big stakes. At least half of them think it's an important election to them. So in those two cases, we're not really seeing people turning away from the election or disengaging with it. They just haven't gotten enough information about these candidates yet. Okay, let's...
During every Supreme Court election, we always talk about, should judges be elected or should they be appointed?
Yep.
So what are they telling us about elections or appointments?
We love voting in elections. 90% say they want elected judges, not appointed judges. And as you'll see in a moment, it's not that they don't see some disadvantages to electing, but still we want to hold on to elections. And this does unite the parties. 85% of Republicans, 91 of independents, and 95 of Democrats. So this is really not an issue.
They agree on something.
They agree, yes.
Yeah.
Let's all hug and sing.
Let's elect them but not know anything about them.
That's right. He said it, not me. He said it. We also want them to talk about issues in the campaign. This is a question, should judicial candidates discuss the issues, or should they avoid discussing the issues in order not to appear to prejudge future cases? So it is a trade-off there. But 79% say they want them to discuss issues. And again, that's pretty bipartisan. 79 of Republicans, 84 of Dems, a little lower for independents at 63. So we do want to vote for them, and we do want them to tell us what they're for and against. Remember that earlier question of whether people were clear on Schimmel and clear on Crawford. That demonstrated a lot of lack of knowledge on those things, but more people were clear than were unclear about both of them.
But the Supreme Court rules tell judges that they shouldn't elaborate on. So
it's a tricky thing,
tricky.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So if people want to know what you're for, but you're constrained in what you can talk about, what kind of signals can you send to indicate what you're for and what you're against? Sometimes you know, in recent races, we've seen people be more explicit or less explicit. This year's still got a month to go. But we asked a question that goes to this. We told people that over the last few years, both Republican and Democratic parties have given large contributions to judicial candidates. Do you think this gives voters a better idea of what the candidates stand for? Or does it reduce the independence of judges from political influence? And here you see the purple dots are reduces independence. 61% say those contributions reduce independence. 38% say it gives people a better idea of what they stand for. Now, I suppose it's possible that you could believe both of these things, that, yeah, the party signal does tell me what they stand for, but it also reduces independence. So maybe people could be really wanting to agree with both of these. But it seems pretty clear they see this problem of you gain that kind of partisan support and you give up something in independence as a result of that. Since both parties are now contributing big bucks to both sides, I suppose it's good for the goose and for the gander.
Well, the Supreme Court race, I believe there's a case pending before the Supreme Court in regards to Act 10. So
Yep.
what's the polling showing about Act 10?
So 42%, we tell people that a judge in December overturned parts of Act 10. What would you like to see done with it? 42% would like it upheld. 54% would like it struck down. There's a partisan gap, but not as big a one as you might have thought. Certainly not as big a one as we would have seen in 2011 or 2012. With 62% of Republicans want it upheld, but 34% would strike it down. Independents are about evenly divided, and Democrats, 76% want it struck down, 17% want it upheld. But again, whether it's 76% of Democrats or 62% of Republicans on the other side, neither of these are in the 70s, 80s, 90s. I'm sorry, one of them is in the 70s. They're not in the 90% range that we saw earlier. I'm a little curious whether this represents a change of opinion of Act 10 over time, or simply because it's a long time in the past, right? 14 years ago. I know most of us in the room remember that, but most of the undergrads on campus would have no personal recollections of it at all.
Abortion policy?
Yeah, this is no change here. There's an abortion case before the state Supreme Court now to be decided in the near future. But this has hardly changed. 64% in favor of abortion rights in all or most cases. 36% say abortion should be illegal in all or most cases. That has barely budged since the Dobbs decision overturned Roe. It's been quite steady for a long time, and even this basic balance was true before Dobbs. There's been a little shift post-Dobbs, but a shift on the order of magnitude of from about 60% to about 65% in favor of abortion rights. There's a substantial party split, but especially Democrats, 97% for abortion to be legal, but only 65% of Republicans take the illegal in all or most cases. So there's a third, 34% of Republicans that favor at least abortion rights in some cases.
Do people favor photo ID at the
Yeah.
poll?
This is a hardy perennial that's coming back to visit us again after being not much talked about recently. This question is, do you think a government-issued photo ID should be required to vote? That's the question we've been asking since 2012 when the photo ID law first came up. And you can see at the top, 77% favor a photo ID law. We have seen this as low as 58%, but it has been a majority in all of the 12 times we've asked about it, and it's been in the 70s the last couple of times we've asked about it. So it hasn't risen appreciably from the mid-70s that it was the last time we asked. Republicans are nearly unanimous on it, and a very high percentage of independents favor it. But even a slight majority of Democrats, 54%, support a photo ID law. Now, of course, the reason we're asking is because there's an amendment on the April ballot to write this into the Constitution. So on this question, we say, as you may know, the current law requires a photo ID to vote. There's an amendment on the April ballot to make that part of the Wisconsin Constitution. Do you think it should be in the Constitution or not? 73% favor making that a constitutional item as opposed to just a law. Slightly less than the 77% that favor the law, but not a huge change. Republicans and independents are very in favor, little change on them. But Democrats now are 10 points more opposed than in favor of it, but still 45% of Democrats favor the amendment. So this is not real surprising if you'd followed the photo ID numbers that we have across those 12 surveys, that after being very controversial at the beginning, it has had solid majority support for the law.
Question on that one? Or
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, real quick.
The question with this one is not so much whether people want the ID or not. The question with it, behind it, is what is not asked with the question being that the conditions for that voter ID are the problem with the Democrats. Because they see it that once when you do have, requirement for the ID, it also says that the conditions to what kind of ID it is up to legislators to put in. And at that point, they could actually reverse and do whatever they want with it. So the question, as simple as it appears, is definitely nonsense.
Let me tell you, no policy question I ever ask about is as simple as the way we frame it in a question on a survey. That's exactly right. By saying there is a law, and do you think it should be in the Constitution, we're at least setting the ground rules that you can be fine with it just being a law as opposed to the extraordinary in the amended Constitution. But let's move on just for time. But yes, it is more complicated and there could be arguments, but that's where we stand.
Let's shift to schools real quick.
Yeah. Satisfaction with public schools in your community, 58% are satisfied or very satisfied, 41% dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. That's roughly where we've been for a while. But notice that Republicans and independents are both marginally dissatisfied with their schools. That's something that didn't used to be the case. Democrats are quite satisfied, though not overwhelmingly so, but 74%. But look at the trend over the time we've been asking this question. And that satisfaction was in the 70% range up through about 2017 or into 2018. But it's fallen to about 60% in recent years. You see one big dip last summer. That was when the MPS problems with the financial reporting and so on broke, and we saw this short-term, really substantial drop in satisfaction. It bounced back up in the 3 polls since then, though this poll is down a little bit from when we asked about it in October. So there are some shifting dynamics to how people feel about the schools that can have consequences, and I think the fact that not just Republicans but also independents are a little bit dissatisfied is a topic that needs to be paid attention to. We also ask a perennial question about which is more important, holding down property taxes or increasing school funding for K-12. 41% say increase spending on public schools, 58% say hold down property taxes. There's a pretty big partisan split, though Democrats are not as united as Republicans are on this. And independents solidly favor holding down property taxes. But here's that trend. You see at the far left, people were slightly more concerned with property taxes than with school funding back in 2013 when we first asked this question. But then it rapidly shifted to the purple line being higher, people favoring more money for schools, and concern with property taxes dropped a lot. And then beginning in 2018 and 19, those started to shift a little bit. And by 2020 or so, we see this steady trend that's been true in all of our polling since, with property tax concerns rising, school funding concern declining. And the two lines cross at about the beginning of 2023, with property taxes just becoming more of a concern poll after poll, and school funding less of a concern poll after poll. So we're obviously going to have a budget debate going on this spring, so this is one part of that.
You asked about education standards. Are they where they should be? Are they too high, too low?
Here we have opinions. So 60% overall say our educational standards in the state are too low, lower than they should be, actually, is the way we asked it. 34% say they're about where they should be, 6% say they are too high. So people have opinions, and they're pretty negative opinions about this. And here's another but. What do you actually know? And so this is the question of whether reading test scores over the last 5 years have gone up, stayed about the same, or gone down. But look at the red dots, haven't heard enough. So overall, 45% say they haven't heard enough to know whether reading tests are up or down. And that's about the same, around 40, 45, 50% for each partisan group. I didn't show you the math score question, and I didn't show you the achievement gap between high and low income students, but they're mirror images of this. We're looking at 40 to 50% who don't know what our best public measures of school performance are. Even on the previous question, a lot of them were very happy to say they thought our standards were too low. And I'm not saying this to criticize people. We all lead busy lives, and I confess I don't rush out to read the test score reports as soon as they come out either. But my point is, in the court race, we're asking people to make really consequential judgments, but they don't know that much about the candidates, at least not yet. On the school race and on school policy more generally, we think the public should have a voice in how schools are run and standards are set. But it's hard for the general public to have a clear idea of the closest we can come to objective measurements of school performance. So this is a dilemma of representative democracy. It's not one that's a failure of the public, but it is a real dilemma in how we structure these consequential policy making topics. And we count on the public to have a voice, but the public often is giving a voice from general, at least a substantial innocence about what the performance really looks like.
Charles, I'm going to ask you to move through these kind of quickly so we have a little bit more time.
Yeah, so this will be really abbreviated. Do you want vouchers for all in the state? And the question is slightly different from that, but brevity. 57% do, 43% do not. But this posed no trade-off between vouchers and anything else. So the next question is, in the upcoming budget, would you prefer to see money to support students attending private schools increased or money to go to public schools increased? And when it's that direct trade-off, it's 33% for private schools, 67% for public schools. Again, we see this pattern in poll after poll after poll, that without any constraints, people like vouchers at least moderately well. But when it comes to a choice between public and private schools, a solid majority still favor public schools. We saw in the last round of the budget that we saw increases for both the voucher schools and for the public schools. Now we have a new budget cycle to go through, and we'll be watching to see whether an agreement can be reached on that. I'm just going to rush, if that's okay, Derek.
Yeah, please.
76% think we should have a major increase for special ed funding. That's a priority for school districts. It has been for a good while. The public's behind it, but notice this is a case where all the parties are behind it too. 59% of Republicans and 72% of independents and 97% of Dems. So this is one of those rare cases of partisan agreement over a particular policy. Evers' proposal for mental health services in the schools, 66% favor that. But here there is a party divide, only 36% of Republicans going up to 94% of Democrats. So not surprisingly, if you mention the governor and the amount, that there's more of a party divide, but still overall support. This is an oldie but goodie. Do you think the shutdown of schools and businesses in response to COVID was an appropriate response, or was it an overreaction? So when we first asked this in early 2020, 82%, I think, said it was an appropriate response. That stayed above 2/3 throughout all of 2020 and only fell into the high 50s a couple of years ago. We haven't asked it, obviously, very often since. But now it's at 49, overreaction 51, appropriate response. And you see a big party gap on this. This is the issue that still structures, or is still structured by partisanship pretty strongly. There's also a proposal that actually has bipartisan support in the legislature to extend Medicaid postpartum health coverage for mothers. It's not about the kids, it's about the moms, for up to 12 months after birth. Overall, pretty popular, 67% in favor of that. Republicans, a little bit opposed, 46 to 54. Sizable majorities of independents and Democrats in favor of that. Ending DEI in universities, schools, and government. We're talking about in Wisconsin, not Trump's initiatives on this. 49% oppose ending DEI, 50% favor ending DEI. I'm surprised it was so closely divided, frankly. But the giant partisan divide here, 86% of Republicans favor, 92% of Democrats oppose, slight majority, 55% of independents oppose ending those initiatives. Red flag laws, the ability to take away someone's guns if they've been found by a judge to be a danger to themselves or others. 85% support that. And again, among partisans, it's 79% of Republicans, 68% of independents, 98% of Democrats. That's very little change in that issue. And of course, the red flag law has not swum its way through the legislature yet, but that's a case where public opinion has been pretty clear and solid. What about forcing state employees to return to the office, to work in their offices? 54% favor that, 45% opposed. Not a very big split, but a pretty sizable.
But what's interesting to me on this is everybody always argues the point that, drain the swamp. There's too many people in state government. But now we want everybody to move back to Madison, right? Where you lived all over the state and had all these different opinions. Now everybody's going back to the swamp,
yeah.
if you will.
I was not smart enough to ask people about their own work situation and whether they preferred working from home or working from the office. It would be interesting if people think what's good for state employees would also be good for them. In both directions, that if they're enjoying working from home, why couldn't state employees do that? We didn't invest more questions on this, but it is a pretty partisan issue as it stands. There's a legislative effort going through to make county law enforcement cooperate with federal immigration authorities in enforcing immigration, identifying and capturing, I guess, immigrants here illegally. I abbreviate that as ICE here for Immigration and Custom Enforcement, but I don't actually phrase it that way in the question. I say federal immigration officials. And there's also if you don't do that, the county will lose some state funding for the county. That's favored by 54%, but opposed by 45%. But you can see the huge partisan divide on this one, like we saw with some of the other immigration issues. Evers has proposed extending a child care subsidy to make that permanent. It's currently part of the COVID relief, which is ending. 54% favorite, 45% opposed. Pretty big, though not quite gigantic partisan splits on that. Finally, the UW systems have asked for an $800 million increase in the budget. That's favored by 42%, but opposed by 57%. Opposed by a very large number of Republicans. And Democrats favor it by 71%, but again, more than a quarter of Democrats would not give the UW that kind of budget increase. So here's a case where Republicans are quite united against it, but Democrats are in favor on balance, but with a non-trivial share of opposition. I'll just mention the approvals real quick.
Yep.
Evers is a little bit favorable, approved, 49 approved, 44 disapproved. That's not much change from October. Party split, no surprise there. The legislature, 38 approved, 49 disapproved, 13% say they don't know enough. Not as much of a partisan split. And finally, the state Supreme Court, 46% approved, 37% disapprove, and 16% don't have an opinion. That, in the context of the Supreme Court race, is useful to know that people are actually fairly positive about the state Supreme Court. Okay. Oh, and we'll skip that and quit.
Any questions?
So we'll take all your questions in 3 minutes.
Here's the microphone.
I got a flyer last week, and it was clear that it was a Trump endorsement of Schimmel. And not only that, but it said they needed Brad Schimmel to complete the Trump agenda. And my question is, who do you think would be most benefited by that endorsement?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very interesting question because I was on a WISC politics panel with Brad Schimmel, the Republican chair, recently. So this was all public, so I'm not talking out of school or anything. And Schimmel was talking about nationalizing the race, because in doing that, you get more national money coming into the party, something Democrats have been successfully doing for a while. And Schimmel was talking about whether that would help Republicans with fundraising. But it would also send these clear signals that I'm talking about. It's not enough that the party is giving each candidate, or the parties are giving each candidate tons of money. But now, if Trump is sort of endorsing, notice that, as far as I know, that's not on the air, not being advertised nationally, but being sent in emails or printed flyers or things like that. And I think, judging from the email I get from both sides that's in their fundraising messages, they're a little more explicit in those fundraising messages than they are on their television advertising at this point. You know, we're such a divided state that we're voting so much along party lines for courts now that I don't know how much it would change things, but it would push us even further to making the court races just de facto partisan events. In the 1980s and 90s, there was almost no relationship between how counties voted for president and how they voted for the Supreme Court. And for the last decade, it's been a nearly perfect match between presidential vote and Supreme Court vote.
Any other questions?
Either one, oh,
I was struck by one of your later slides on legislative approval. The independents seem to be identical with the Democrats. Any insights on that?
let's just back up here. Legislative approval, yeah, you're right. Well, they're not quite identical, so I don't think I mistakenly used the same numbers twice, so that's one thing. I guess I don't have a huge insight into this, so I should sensibly stop talking with I don't know. You had your hand up. We could maybe squeeze one in.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering, on your DEI slide, did you give respondents a definition of DEI, or did every respondent bring their own?
We spoke it out. So we said diversity, equity, and inclusion, parentheses, known as DEI. So we had that much information about it, but we didn't have a long explanation about what those programs actually do. Back to your point about all of the details of policy that we don't include in a question, it applies here as well. Certainly, Donald Trump has talked so much about it in the last 6 weeks that at least the term has got to be a lot better known now than it might have been a year ago.
So, Charles, thank you very much.
Okay,
If we
thank
give Charles
you.
a round of applause.
Thank you all for coming.